Hello and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is G. Mark Hardy. I am your host for today, and we are going to be doing, kind of a rant. 7 things that are broken in cybersecurity. Now, before we go into the rant, a couple asks, if I may. Hopefully you're enjoying our content that we've been putting out now for getting close to 4 years, and you're either watching us on YouTube or listening to us on your favorite podcast channel. But we gave them more great ways to help improve your CISO tradecraft. We've got a Substack newsletter where you can get weekly email on topics to help you as a CISO. And on our LinkedIn page, we share several articles and several references each week that we think will be helpful in making you better executives and leaders in the cybersecurity area. A lot of signal, very little noise. We'll make it worth your while. And besides, it's all free content. So consider it our gift to you to help you out in your cyber industry. Now, if you want any links for this, go to CISOTradecraft.com, follow the subscription links. And if you're following us on a podcast channel and you have not already given us a review, if you love our content, we'd appreciate a 5-star review, and that helps other people find us because it prioritizes us just a little bit higher than the other folks that are out there. So thanks for supporting us, and now into the show. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about 7 things that are broken in cybersecurity, and these are things that we've been looking at CISO Tradecraft and think some of them may need to change. But in some cases, we don't hear a lot of people talking about them. And to a certain extent, I've tried to be a little bit of high school debate club and look at both sides of the issue to see if I can't articulate effectively, in some of these cases, a counter-argument to some of the arguments that I'm putting out. Doesn't mean I can't make up my mind, but it does mean that you make better decisions as an executive when you hear multiple viewpoints. So, without any delay, here goes. Number 1. Cyber does not have a unified license and therefore lacks a unified voice. Now, here's what we mean by that. If you look at many other industries, you'll generally see a government entity that requires some licensure or creates a code of conduct and best practices that companies or individuals need to follow. That doesn't really exist in cyber. Yet in other industries, we'll see that a lot. For example, accountants will get their certified public accountant or CPA license so they can legally perform accounting work in the state in which they reside. Lawyers need to pass a bar exam after law school. Healthcare industry requires doctors to procure a license in each state in which they practice medicine. And even the construction industry requires architects, engineers, plumbers, electricians to get licenses that certify they have the skills to perform the job. And these licenses are generally issued by the state, and they create a uniform code of conduct that states what controls must be followed if something is going to be up to code. Okay, so let me restate this in terms of risk. Who can cause more risk to an organization? Plumber or the CISO? Now, only one has a license and clear career guidance, and hint, it's not the CISO. Now, you might be thinking that's all well and good, and the reason we don't have licenses and exams in cyber is that technology changes too fast, and anything we create won't even be good enough, or it wouldn't last. Well, I'll argue it's not quite true. For example, medical industry is constantly innovating. New drugs, procedures, and research are happening all the time. Not only that, but new strains of colds, flus, and infections arise every year. Doctors have to stay on top of the best way to treat medical issues, and this seems to parallel us as a cyber industry, yet I don't hear anybody talking about waiving medical licenses for doctors so more people can act as doctors to treat patients. Why do I think of Dr. Nick from The Simpsons here? The legal sector also changes all the time. City, state, and federal regulatory bodies routinely create new regulations. Legislators create new laws. Governors and presidents create new executive orders, and judges will make rulings or interpretations on laws and set the tone on how future judges should evaluate case law. And this means that the law and our interpretation of it is constantly changing and evolving as well. The relevant point here is that other industries have created a license and a process to stay relevant as things change so that it can be done as cyber as well. And what's more is that by creating standards, we often create associations where industry professionals can unify their voice. Accountants have the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Lawyers have the American Bar Association. Doctors have the American Medical Association. In cyber, we have things like ISSA, ISC squared, etc., but it feels more like a networking event than anything that is standardizing our industry on best practices. You might also be thinking of companies that sell certifications like ISACA, and we think it's a good start since they develop frameworks like COBIT, but we still would like to see more of this in our sector. Okay, debate hat. On the flip side, there's a strong argument against this. 15 years ago, Senators Jay Rockefeller from West Virginia and Olympia Snowe from Maine proposed the eponymously named Rockefeller-Snowe Cybersecurity Act, aka the Cybersecurity Act of 2009. And there are a lot of useful ideas in this document, and several of them have played out. But one thing that I remember that stood out, Section 7, which at the time got a lot of cybersecurity professionals up in arms. I think it was one of the few times I actually went ahead and wrote to my congressman and said, hey, this might not be a good idea. And it's fairly brief, so let me quote it. Section 7, licensing and certification of cybersecurity professionals. Within 1 year after the date of enactment of this Act, the Secretary of Commerce shall develop or coordinate and integrate a national licensing, certification, and periodic recertification program for cybersecurity professionals. And beginning 5 years after the date of enactment of this Act, it shall be unlawful for any individual to engage in business in the United States or to be employed in the United States as a provider of cybersecurity services to any federal agency or an information system or network designated by the President or the President's designee as a critical infrastructure information system or network who is not licensed and certified under this program. Now, how do you feel about being labeled as a criminal for rendering cybersecurity services to any entity that's related to our 16 critical infrastructure sectors without having a formal designation from the U.S. government? And when have you ever seen the federal government make things better without first creating a ponderous bureaucracy that consumes more and more resources? Now, this bill did make it out of committee. Now, help that Senator Rockefeller was the chair, but never received a House vote. So although my co-host thinks that a government cybersecurity license may be a good thing, personally, I disagree. Now, what do you think? Give us some feedback and let us know. Number 2 on our list of the 7 things that are broken are auditors that create resource waste. Now, hire any auditor from the big 4.5, as I like to call them, because you never know who's going to go out of business or merge, to look at your organization and perform a risk assessment or a cyber audit. And what's the first thing they'll ask for? Can you show me your policies and controls? We built a whole industry around these things. You'll get an audit finding if you don't have said policy. You'll get an audit finding if that policy wasn't updated and reviewed in the last 12 months. You'll get an audit finding if someone isn't taking the required training on that policy, and so on and so on. At the end of the day, here's something that most auditors might be overlooking. Most people don't read the policies. Additionally, policies are not as important as the people, process, and tools that are tasked to implement them. For example, let's say we need a policy that ensures access control is properly maintained. We might require 2 people to approve access to a system, for example, the manager of the person requesting access and the owner of the asset to which access is being requested. Additionally, we might require yearly access reviews of that system or quarterly access reviews if it's a critical system. At the end of the day, there's a policy about access control. Now, what's the rate of return of reading that policy every year for grammatical issues and forcing changes? Would it be better to only change it when there's a new issue that arises where the old policy doesn't make sense? You see, by wasting everybody's time each year to review a policy and make the executives sign off again, we're taking precious resources away from other things that might be a better use of their time. I'd rather have an identity management tool like SailPoint that can track when a person changes job responsibilities. It still has access rights for the old position, and then we automatically revoke that access, then have a policy that people don't read and don't follow. Now remember, if you say we have operationalized their policy into a tool, but lack a formal policy, you can expect an audit finding. Now, doesn't that seem broken? We need to get our industry to change here. Our standards focus too much on policies, not the implementation of the process, which is way more important. Remember, policies don't stop attackers. The safeguards that arise from the implementation of those policies is what stops attackers. Focus the audit on the effectiveness of the results of the practice versus requiring and maintaining policies. Okay, so here's a counter-argument. You can't measure what you can't see, and you inspect what you expect. If you don't have a written policy, how do you hold people accountable for their behavior? Imagine an HR department without any written policy. Well, if you don't forbid certain actions you don't want in the workspace, in writing, you're likely to face wrongful dismissal suits when you fire somebody for crossing the line. Further, auditors are not there to inspect your entire value chain for security. They're there to ensure you are starting from a known good position and you practice what you preach. So yes, audits do create some friction in the workplace, but it's a necessary friction to ensure you're not sliding into trouble. Number 3 on our list of the 7 things that are broken in cybersecurity is that auditors saying each control is a high finding. Can we agree that if we have 500 controls for IT organization to follow, that not everyone is going to be equal? We need tiering of controls. For example, you probably have a control for vulnerability management that says you need to patch your critical systems in 30 days or less. Your organization also probably has a control that says you need to have your test data properly masked in your non-production environment. Now, if you don't implement either control properly, which one is going to have the highest likelihood to negatively impact your company? Obviously, it's the patching control. However, if you have audit findings on the second control, then you find your resources are being gobbled up to help control remediation activities that really may not be all that important to focus on. As an industry, we need to go back and challenge our current activities. Perhaps having over 500 controls to implement to follow the NIST or COVID or ITIL is kind of dumb to begin with. What if we took the advice of the Australian Signals Directorate, which is the Australian vision of the NSA, and focus on just the essential 8 controls? These top 8 controls are the most important mitigation strategies which have the highest ability to mitigate harm to enterprises. If we begin there, we will reduce the harm of bad actors more than anything else versus lying about our relative compliance to 500 controls. These top 8 controls are preventing the execution of unapproved programs through application controls, patching applications, blocking Office macros, hardening applications, restricting administrative privileges, patching operating systems, multi-factor authentication, and daily backups. Sounds like a pretty good list. Note that we did a whole podcast about them way back in episode number 16 in 2021, so be sure to check that one out. And we would argue that any organization that gets these top 8 controls correct would be significantly safer than doing an average implementation of the 500 controls of time suck. Remember, too many controls equal too many resources wasted on the wrong activities. Now, of course, the question is who has the authority in your company to say we are rescinding all of these old 500 controls and starting back with the basics of being amazingly over the 8? We've never seen such a control removal at a large scale performed in a Fortune 500 company. So, well, good luck with clawing back and preventing your cyber resources from being stolen each year in order to fix less important control activities. All right, time for the counter-argument. Controls work because organizations are compelled to follow them. That's why the U.S. Department of Defense is rolling out the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC program. The Defense Industrial Base, or DIB, has been self-attesting for years that they're fully compliant with all the security standards of the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, or DFARS. Yet the DIB has been hemorrhaging sensitive information to foreign adversaries like a stuck pig. Did you run a marathon every week last year? Are you checking or are you just asking? If you're just asking, sure. The most recent iteration of CMMC 2.0 changed Level 1 back to self-attestation, creating some disappointment for those of us who trained up on CMMC, paid our annual fees, and now we're told that DIB is going to be like Bill Murray in Stripes. You trained yourself, sir. Again, accountability is the goal of auditors, not paperwork drills. I've been a certified information systems auditor for over 20 years, and I agree that practice is more important than policy, but you can't hold people accountable for the former without the latter. And that said, the Pareto principle lends balance to an audit. You've probably heard of it, also known as the 80-20 rule, which states that 80% of consequences come from 20% of the causes. Your security is mostly affected by the 20% that matters. Wisdom consists of knowing which 20% to emphasize. If all the major stuff is done right, I'm willing to let pass some of the minor things. Unless you're putting up the satellite on orbit, then you can't fix it after it's launched, because then you got to get to 100%. Otherwise, you're stuck with it, unless it's something like the Hubble telescope, and then you go up and you put eyeglasses on it. The fourth item, what's broken in cyber, is that cyber organizations love to chase the new shiny toy. Let's go back in time a bit. In the 1980s, we had only a handful of cybersecurity tools. In fact, we didn't even call it cybersecurity back then. It was information security, or InfoSec. In 1985, I took a graduate course in computer security at George Washington University from Professor Lance Hoffman. And every student had to do a project for the course. One student wrote the first iteration of RiskCalc, which Lance purchased and then marketed for several years as a quantitative risk assessment software package. And actually in 1986, I left DC to go work for the company that was marketing RiskCalc and worked there to develop RiskPack, a qualitative risk assessment software tool. I love the fact that my professor was an entrepreneur. Anyway, my project was that year I went to the 7th annual Computer Security Show, and this is 1985. I can't even find any record of this thing anymore. I was searching the internet prep for the show. But I collected brochures from every company that exhibited I built a compendium of all known computer security vendors in the space. Take that, Gartner. I think there's almost 30 of them. We've come a long way since then. Now, next in the 1990s, we started seeing attacks that we wanted to prevent. So we built things like antivirus and firewalls and hardened configuration guides for systems to stop bad actors. However, we couldn't prevent every attack, so we then moved to detecting when bad actors got into our systems by using intrusion detection systems and security information event monitoring tools. Detection was good, but if our systems were down, we needed to respond. So we added EDR and SOAR tools, and now we have evolved to recovery solutions to stop the negative impacts of ransomware. The point is here, we always seem to need new tools to make us more secure. However, despite most organizations having between 50 and 70 perhaps different cybersecurity tools, there are risks that still don't get mitigated, and attackers will still take advantage of those. If you ask our CFOs, they'll tell you they get sick of paying for so many tools, resources to support those tools, and prices that just go up every year. And that's why we need to go back to basics here. So let's focus on the top 3 risks of any company: preventing people from getting phished, keeping your internet-facing servers secure, and limiting the harm of your company losing its data through third parties. To stop phishing, you really need 3 things. A good solution which blocks phishing, such as Proofpoint or Abnormal Security, is a good place to start. Phishing training that teaches folks how to spot and report a phishing attack is also key. Also, working with your SOC to have a standardized incident response plan for when someone reports a phish that some other employee already clicked is going to be needed. Now let's look at keeping internet-facing systems and applications secure. Software ages like milk, not like wine. You need to keep software systems patched without undue delay. Did you patch each layer of the stack? For example, the operating systems, the operating system packages, the middleware, the web applications, the web app libraries, and so on. Now that your software is patched, are you using hardened configurations? Remember, there are a lot of insecure defaults, so let's turn all that off. For example, do you allow any PowerShell script to run on your Windows endpoints? Or do you have a deny all policy for PowerShell scripts that have not been approved and specifically added to the allow list? The first invites malware to run, and the second helps prevent it. Look for things like the DISA-STIG, CIS benchmarks, and other hardening guides to secure your enterprise. And finally, if you write a custom software application, then please use scanners that can find those custom vulnerabilities. They could be SAST or DAST, IAST, RASP, container, cloud scan, security scans. The point is, if you wrote the code, then you are responsible for finding the vulnerabilities and fixing them. So do more to keep your web app secure than buying dozens of security tools. And finally, limiting the harm of third parties losing your data is difficult. However, this is where your procurement and legal team can come into play. Include language in contracts that is in your company's favor that protects your company when a third party loses data. If you can get this type of language into your contracts, as well as requirements that the third party will perform cyber activities to keep their organization secure, you can do a lot to minimize the harm of them losing your data. All right, I'm going to have to agree with this recommendation. You want to avoid the bright, shiny object syndrome, where the latest or newest thing seems irresistible until the next bright, shiny object comes out. Some of us have children like that, maybe even partners. In any case, you should be on risk identification and remediation. Once you've done that, if there's a tool that will help you automate that process, then consider buying it. But also heed the advice of Rafiq Rahman, the author of the CISO Mind Map, who is a recent guest, and has as his second recommendation for this year to consolidate and rationalize security tools. It was tough as a CISO after fighting to get funding for a product or service to hand that money back next year because your needs have changed. You can't get authorization for the next set of tools to protect against your new threats, but a good CISO is a trustworthy steward of organizational resources, and showing that you're running a cost-effective business unit may help you increase your priority when competing for budget next year. The fifth thing that seems broken in cyber is misplaced accountability. Today, most organizations think cyber is in charge of preventing and stopping all cyber attacks, which at a cursory look almost sounds right. However, this understanding is wrong. Perhaps the best advice ever given by auditors is to follow the 3 lines of defense. Now, if you haven't heard of it, let me just explain it quickly. It comes from the Institute of Internal Auditors. With any critical activity or control in an organization, the 3 lines of defense provide guidance on how that control should be governed. Let's take an example of keeping software patched. The first line of defense is the control owner, the person who should keep the software patched. That's usually not the cyber team. So software developers who wrote the code, who work in the CIO's department. They're the ones responsible for keeping the software secure. The second line of defense performs risk management and compliance activities, and here is where cyber comes into play. An organization that monitors the practices of the first line. If every developer patched their software, we'd have a lot less problems. However, take any organization with 10 or more apps, and you'll find some teams that don't focus on patching. Someone needs to police this and go back to IT leadership and say there are specific vulnerabilities that need to be fixed by these teams. The third line of defense is the audit team. They act as independent assessors to say if the outcomes match the desired goals of the organization and its controls activity. For example, let's say your vulnerability numbers get worse each month, despite cyber telling them and the developers to fix them and pushing on them. Here's where we have a systemic risk. That risk needs to be brought up to the executive leadership team or the board for risk approval or remediation. Guess what? Auditors have access to the board when they present their result, because the board is accountable for anything that's in there, including the findings. And so, therefore, you as a CISO may not have ready access to the decision makers, but auditors often do. The three-line of defense model is a more holistic approach than cyber being accountable for everything, especially when you may have only one person in cyber for every 50 developers. Make sure your organization understands this way of thinking if you don't want unrealistic expectations that cyber can prevent every attack. Now, recently I presented a CISO Tradecraft episode on responsibility, accountability, and authority. And one of the biggest frustrations I have heard through my career is people assigned responsibility and accountability without the requisite authority. In a way, that's what we're talking about here. This is not a cybersecurity issue. This is not an auditing issue. This is a leadership issue. Assignment of responsibility entails trust. You are responsible for applying, by Friday, the most recent Windows 11 patches to all enterprise PCs that connect to the corporate network. All right, now if your Windows policies allow users to postpone patches, that person's unlikely to get the job done. So you need to align your technology and your policies along with the job function and ensure that there is a way to not only identify who isn't doing their job, but more importantly, who cannot do their job, and then go fix that. The sixth item that's broken, it's a constant need for degree requirements in cybersecurity jobs. A couple weeks ago, I attended the Sunshine Cyber Conference in Tampa. The closing fireside chat was with Jake Braun, the acting principal deputy director of the White House Office of the National Cyber Director. And one of the first complaints that he heard when he took that job, he said that all the federal cyber positions in that director required a 4-year degree. And he's thinking like, yeah, no way. But he checked. Sure enough, every last one of them did. Now he's working to change that requirement, and I'll concur with his initiative. Consider the skills that are transferred in a 4-year degree. They don't actually teach folks what they need to know to be effective. For example, let's say you want someone to work on the SOC team as an incident responder. Most schools will teach folks how to program in C++ or Java or Python, maybe some Power BI application development or database classes, or even some basic networking. The most useful thing you learn in college that you can apply at work is probably how to write well in Microsoft Word or build pretty PowerPoint presentations and analyze data in Excel. However, you'd be extremely hard-pressed to find any college or university where professors actually teach cutting-edge tools in cyber, because in most universities, professors don't have any huge budget, sometimes not even really meaningful budget. So they'll try to use free tools. This means you won't be playing with CrowdStrike or similar vendors that likely be found in a real-world SOC. Additionally, the courses are taught mostly by professors who have not had the opportunity to gain real-world experience in their academic careers. Now, one might ask, what does getting a PhD by spending months researching a topic and writing a thesis have to do with getting your hands dirty by working incidents in a SOC? It doesn't. Yet PhDs and ABDs, those are all but dissertation, are often the ones who end up teaching these classes. The end result is you have students spending years on potentially the wrong material from folks who have not had the privilege to have practical real-world experience recently in their careers. Now, notice there are some good lecturers who do have that experience, but that isn't common. Most classes in a 4-year university will be taught by a PhD or a graduate student. Now, consider the alternative where an employer may wish to hire a high school graduate who's truly motivated. Provide them with a mentor, have them shadow a team member who has been doing the role for a while, put them through a couple SANS certifications, and create really good standardized processes that they could follow. If you can follow that formula, you can create a well-qualified employee that costs much less than what college graduates are expecting. That person's likely going to remain committed to you because you're investing in them. It seems like a superior approach that works for everyone. But of course, let's see if you can get this through your HR gatekeepers. Now, back to a counterpoint. Let's say you're interviewing two candidates, one of whom has a 4-year degree and the other took a few related classes but left college for the workforce and has 2 years of hands-on experience. The same age, show the same aptitude, which one do you hire? Now, I'm going to suggest that the person with the degree. Why? Not because the degree means current cutting-edge proficiency with cybersecurity tools, because the other person might have those, but because this person completed their degree. Let me explain. There are courses in every degree program that students probably hate, but they take them, they complete them because they're degree requirement. Let's say both candidates completed the same cybersecurity courses at the same university. Isn't that what counts for the job? Perhaps. But consider that the first candidate slogged his way through an English lit class or a political science course. Second candidate passed on those. The first candidate met all the degree requirements with passing grades, while the second candidate cherry-picked the course catalog and then left for the workforce. Now, every job has duties and requirements that nobody wants to do, but they still have to be done. That's kind of why we get paid, right? Now, who's more likely to do that work? The person who is shown to write the paper, didn't want to write, and get a passing grade on it, or the person who just walked away? My point is that degree counts for more than just domain knowledge transfer. It demonstrates an ability to set a goal, remain committed to that goal, and achieve it. That's the type of employee I want to hire. Our seventh and final item is a lack of federal data privacy and data law. Let's say you run a company that sells T-shirts online to customers in all 50 states. Unfortunately, some bad actor just found a SQL injection vulnerability on your company's website and has stolen all of your customer data. How do you decide to declare a data breach? Whom do you need to notify? What do you need to say? You see, each of these questions is where it gets tricky. See, the truth is there isn't a federal standard. You have to go state by state. If you go to IAPP.org's website, you'll see that roughly 15 different states have signed legislation on data privacy, and every law is different. It means you'll have to work with legal counsel to determine if what was stolen actually violates the law, and that's not easy. In addition, if you go into international, you'll find over 100 different laws out there from different countries, different regions, different areas, all of which are a little bit different. Now, some states might say certain PII data like your address or phone number is considered private. Others may say that it's not private. Under GDPR, your IP address is considered personally identifiable information. That's ephemeral. That's just a sign. Yep, it is what it is. And what's worse is each state can have a different time period when you need to disclose. Now, it's usually around 72 hours, but let's repeat what we're hearing. In the middle of a chaotic cyber event, when you don't fully understand what's happening, you need to get your legal organization to provide written definitive guidance on 15 different laws about whether they need to file with each state attorney general's office. If they actually say yes, then we need to do the filing in all these different states. You then have to create a message with your executive communications team, go to 15 different attorneys general websites and file those within 72 hours. And I also understand it gets worse, since your in-house legal will also be working with external counsel and seeking official reports from an external forensic company like Mandiant, who's investigating the breach. Also, don't forget that some of the signed laws aren't fully into effect because they might start in 2025. And additionally, these 12 different states have new laws being debated on data privacy, which will not follow a uniform standard and can be passed by their legislatures at any time. Can we not agree this is some sort of madness? It would be much better if we took a stance like Europe and create a single standard like GDPR or DORA to standardize what companies need to do to be compliant across all 50 states and centralize the reporting in a single federal location for all data breaches. Now, it's a silver lining to all this opportunity. Currently, there's a piece of legislation called the American Privacy Rights Act of 2024, or APRA. It's being considered in Congress. If passed, it should help significantly in this regard. However, these types of bills usually don't pass. You'll get them if you could hang it like an ornament on a Christmas tree on a must-pass bill. And that's often how some of these side bills get through, because they're not going to waste all the time for debate and committee and harmonizing things from both the Senate and the House on a very, very narrow bill. Now, what happens, though, if the federal law is less restrictive than an existing state law? For example, the governor of California might object, saying that they'd have to lower their data privacy requirements of their citizens. So California opposes this federal law. Plus, lobbyist groups for most companies hate more laws that negatively impact the bottom line, so they usually oppose no laws as well. So long story short, it can be quite difficult to pass a federal data privacy law, despite the fact it's probably one of the things we need most to minimize the burdens on companies today. What's the best way forward? Probably using a template like the Uniform Commercial Code. The UCC is not a federal law. It is a uniformly adopted state law. It's been described as the backbone of American commerce and allows companies to do business across state lines without a patchwork of different laws with different compliance requirements. Do you think it's time for a uniform cybersecurity code? Don't write your congressman, write your state representative. Okay, we hope you've enjoyed hearing about these 7 things that we believe are broken in cyber. I bet if you listen to the show for a while, you might be thinking about something else, or an 8th, or even a 9th thing that we probably should have said, but we didn't. So do us a favor and share that idea with us on LinkedIn. You can just tag us at CISO Tradecraft. We'd love to see what you think, and maybe we can include that in future thoughts and episodes. If you disagree with us on a topic, let us know your thoughts too. It's totally okay to have a different opinion. This is how we get smarter when we discuss these topics and learn from each other. I understand our industry isn't perfect. However, it's a fantastic place to be, and I think a lot of us wouldn't want to be in any other career. So that's why we're here right now talking about CISO Tradecraft. So thank you again for listening. And remember, if you learned something today, pay it forward. Share with a friend. Something as simple as a post that says, I just started following CISO Tradecraft and I've been learning a lot. And I recommend that you subscribe too. Recently, both Julie Chapman and Christopher Will did just that on LinkedIn and gives us encouragement to keep producing more of this great content. We wish everybody only the best on their adventures to learn their CISO Tradecraft. So again, thank you very much for listening. This is your host, G. Mark Hardy, and until next time, stay safe out there.